Alrighty, so we have it started here. I'm just waiting for people to kind of roll on in and then I'll get going. And then Diane, if you have any slides, you might want to put them up while we're waiting for people to come in. There we go, perfect. All right, and we kind of see your desktop screen there.
I'm sorry?
So I'm seeing like, not the full slide, I'm seeing like a half, seeing like PowerPoint presenter view is what I'm seeing.
Maybe there we go. Sharing the right screen.
There we go.
Yay.
All righty, so I'll go ahead and get started here. Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jackie, and I'm with the New Mexico Small Business Development Center. Today we have Ms. Diane Villegas joining us, who is a certified SCORE mentor, holds an MBA from University of New Mexico, owns her own marketing consulting agency, and has over 25 years of experience in the marketing industry. Diane will be presenting today's topic, which is marketing is a marathon, not a sprint. Thank you so much for joining us. I do want to say here, yep, if you want to go to the next slide there, Diane. So we will be using the Q&A function as well as the chat to take questions, and we welcome attendee participation. So please don't hesitate to ask any questions as we go along. We will be answering questions throughout and at the end of the webinar. So this slide that you see before you covers some of the COVID-19 business resource links, which I won't go over in too much detail, as we will be sending all of these slides to you at the end of the presentation and at the end of the webinar via email. So please visit our website at nmsbdc.org to view our upcoming no-cost webinars or to sign up for our no-cost counseling services. And again, I will also send up a follow-up email with all of this information for you. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll hand you over to Diane.
Thank you so much. So it's already been a little bit mentioned about what my background is, but this is essentially it. You know, I've been in the marketing realm for quite some time. And in my solo work, I have worked with numerous companies, you know, all the way down from solopreneurs and through my corporate experience through multinational companies. So what we're going to talk about today is something that's relevant to companies of all sizes. And one of the things that is critical when we start talking about marketing is looking at it as a long-term goal, not necessarily a short-term sprint. So the analogy that I like to use is marketing is a marathon. And when you think about a marathon and you think about, you know, is this something I can do, what I want to do, how would somebody even train for this? Anytime you think about a marathon, it's always a long-term vision. It's not just something like, I'm going to pop off my couch and I'm going to go do this. Well, marketing is pretty much the same thing. You know, and unfortunately, there tends to be a thought process out there that, well, you know, maybe marketing is just a one-time quick thing and I can just do this and I'll just up and make it happen. Well, that's kind of the sprint mentality. And when we have that sprint mentality without the proper training, this is where we end up. We end up in a situation where we barely make it across the starting line. We're gassed out and we're not really making any kind of progress that we want to make. So for the next, 45, 50 minutes or so, we're going to talk about the differences in how you overcome the situation where you're gassed out and you don't want to do this anymore, and get you to the point where you feel strong and victorious and crossing that, finish line for the marathon. So before we go into how we're going to do this, let's talk about the things that maybe aren't going to work so well for you. And we're going to talk about avoiding some of the more common mistakes that I've seen in the marketing industry. And again, this is stuff that can apply to solopreneurs, or a company of one, all the way to, multinational billion-dollar type of companies. And if you are guilty of any of these, please know there is absolutely no judgment whatsoever. you're in very good company. I've seen this with lots and lots of people. So let's look at what some of these things are. And it kind of follows a little bit of a storyline. So a lot of times you have the person in charge thinking that the world thinks the way that they do, and they don't really see beyond themselves. So this can be a problem in a number of different ways. When you have a small business owner thinking that everybody is like them, they're not really seeing the potential in the market that is. The other thing is that when there's a mentality of not really fully seeing beyond yourself, they tend to do a lot of the work themselves, or feel like they have to do all of the work themselves, rather than find people that have the skills and qualifications to do the work for them. So whatever your situation is, if you're doing the work yourself because you like to do it, which is awesome, or you're doing it because you don't really have the resources to hire somebody, that's okay too. But let's make sure that we kind of go through these things to make sure that you can do the best job possible. So once people kind of get out into the market, they have the perception that everyone is their target. And if you think about a classic bullseye, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And it's really that sweet spot in the middle that you want to get to. And not everybody is going to fit in that little tiny sweet spot. And one thing I want to say up front is your budget is going to have a direct correlation on how fine-tuned you need to target. So unless you have an unlimited budget, I would say that your target is not an unlimited resource. So just a little key thing to keep in mind there. We also need to look at what your brand is, and is what your brand conveying matching the marketing messages that you're sending. A lot of times, again, in the mindset of not seeing beyond themselves, business owners or marketing heads or whoever it may be, the key stakeholders here, they personally may get tired of seeing a particular message in the market, or they feel like they've seen it a lot, which they may have, but that's not necessarily the case for your prospects or your potential clients. So you have to make sure that these things are in sync together, so you're not confusing your market, but also so that you have that out there long enough so you're making the kind of impact that you want to make. Next is allocating a budget. Not all companies allocate a budget for marketing. And quite frankly, it's a little alarming how big of a percentage that is. And one thing that I would say to you about that is, if you don't have the resources to spend, whether it's manpower resources or actual physical dollars, it's not going to get done, or it's not going to get done well. Whatever you put budget to, you're going to make sure that you use efficiently. So when you start putting together your plan, make sure you have budget allocated to that, whether it's hours or actual dollars. So a lot of times, businesses know they have to do marketing. They don't really know where to get started. And so they procrastinate, and they put it off and put it off and put it off. And then finally they feel like, oh gosh, something's happening, whether it's an event or a sale or a community situation, that they feel like they have to do something right away. And so they rush and do something, or rather anything. And the problem with that is that might not be the right thing for you to do for your market, for your potential clients, or for your budget. So the less you have thought put into something, the more likely you are to waste your resources, and you don't want to do that. So let's not procrastinate. A lot of times in that situation, when the procrastinating is happening, it's a situation where they see one tactic, like, oh, okay, I got this great offer from a newspaper guy, or I see my competition is doing TV, so I need to run out and do TV, and they focus on one tactic. The problem with that is when you want to reach your consumers, you need to hit them multiple times. If you Google how many times you need to hit somebody, you're going to see anything from 7 to 11 times, but they're not always going to be in the same place. You want to be able to hit them in multiple areas where they'll see your message. A one tactic approach is going to be rather slow and painful and probably not going to work. So you want to think in a multi-tactical kind of way. The next big issue that happens is, people will put that one tactic out in the market, and they expect, the door to fly open with people rushing to buy their product in the matter of hours or days. Well, that's not how it works. You have to build momentum in the market. You have to gain, market awareness, brand awareness, all that good stuff. And so quick results are not to be expected. So again, think of the marathon mindset, not so much the sprint mindset. If you want to see the long-term results, you're going to have to be in the game long-term. So often when I see businesses that, they do this kind of downward spiral, they focus on one tactic, they expect quick results. When they don't see those quick results, they stop what they're doing completely, which is the absolute last thing you want to do. And then the next step is they cut their marketing budget, saying that marketing doesn't work. Why am I wasting my money on this? Well, quite frankly, that's just the opposite of what you should be doing. If your marketing tactics aren't working, you need to reevaluate them, maybe look at putting either more dollars into your budget or looking at reallocating on how you're using them. So these are all the things that I would advise not to do. And if you've done some of these, you probably feel, a little bit of connection of some of the results of what has happened from these, but past is past. Let's move forward and let's see what it's going to take to get you feeling like this. Because again, that marathon is where we want to be. We want to be crossing that long-term goal line where we're seeing the results of all of our hard work and build-up. So if you're a runner or if you're into any kind of sports training or physical fitness, you know that the key to all of that is balancing structure and flexibility. You have to have a plan of how you're going to get there, but you also need to be flexible, knowing that conditions can change at a moment's notice. So if you're a marathoner and your daily run is to take you out for 15 miles one day, but it's raining really hard, well, you're not just going to stop. You're going to find alternatives. You're going to run inside, or you're going to hop on a bike inside, whatever. You're going to find alternatives. And that's how you need to look at your marketing plan also. Your plan is to guide you for your long-term vision, but you need to remain nimble and flexible to get there. So what does that look like? What would a plan look like? So you're going to see this slide a lot in this presentation. And as a marketing person, I tend to gravitate towards visual elements. And I hope this helps you to sort of see what it is that you need to do when you put together your marketing plan. And I boiled it down to really simple components, 6 simple components of what it takes to be successful. The first top part that we're going to be looking at is your brand and your message. So this is kind of one of those monopoly things of like, don't pass go, don't collect $200, don't do any of that until you have your brand established. So let's talk about that for a little bit, and then we'll go into what your core message is, all right? So this is kind of your precursor to building your marketing plan. The meat of your marketing plan is going to be these 6 boxes here, and I'll show you how all of those relate in just a little bit. And then we'll also talk about the foundation for all of these elements in these 3 boxes down here. So hopefully it'll make sense to you as we go along. So let's talk about brand and message. All right. So as we kind of talked about, before you build your plan, you want to build your brand. So what is that? A lot of times people will think brands and they'll think like, okay, McDonald's, Burger King or Nike or whoever, these big iconic brands, and they have a hard time relating what that big iconic brand is and how to apply that to themselves. Well, it's actually fairly simple when you think about it. It really is what your image is. And when you think about what your image is, a lot of it has to do with you and your values. So whether you're the company owner and you have, a company of 20, 50, 100, whatever, or if you're a solopreneur and you're a company of one, it comes down to what do you stand for and what is your image. You want to think about, how there's 3 components that I really like to discuss with business owners when it comes to figuring out what your brand is. And sometimes a good way to do this is to talk to the people around you that know you on different levels to get their impressions of you. You go to people that you trust, they'll be honest with you. But really your brand is 3 things. It's who you are, who you personally stand for, or what your company stands for, what you want to be, what your aspirational goals are, what you strive to be, what you want your company to represent. And then the third component is how others perceive you. And so as a company, that's where you could do a lot of the social listening and do, the brand surveys, those kinds of things to kind of get a sense of how your customers are perceiving you. Or if you're a micro business, talk to your customers. That's one of the best ways to get information about your business, is to simply talk to your customers. As you're considering your brand, you want to think about how you're different than your competition. One of the things that I always recommend is don't focus on what your competitors are doing and talking about them and what they're not doing, but focus on how you're different in your own unique way. I would never advocate speaking poorly or knocking any of your competitors in any of your marketing materials. It really just makes you look bad. But focus on how you're different. What is it that you bring to the table that's different than any of your competitors that your potential clients would connect with versus connecting with another organization? And that really comes down to, what are the benefits that you provide? How can you help them with the problem they have or the need that they have, and how can you be the resource for them? And one of the things you want to think about is, what is it that you are really selling? a lot of times people sort of interrelate sales and marketing when it's actually two very different things. Sales is actually the transaction, whereas marketing is the education of the product or service. So when we think of marketing, try to shift that to education. So you have to educate your potential consumer on what it is you're really selling. Now, if we had an infinite amount of time to talk about this, we'd probably go into some of the psychology of what people need and what their base needs are and those kinds of things. But really what it kind of comes down to is you're selling somebody an emotional need, or you're fixing an emotional need. So when you're selling somebody a car, for example, yeah, there's the logical, it has, 4 doors, it does this, blah, blah, blah. But at the base of it, what you're really selling to your consumer is safety, security, the things around their family, their job, whatever it is, but it usually comes down to some sort of core emotional need. So keep that in mind when you put together your brand and how you're going to be servicing them. So now that we start looking at core messaging, this is really the why. Why are you doing what you're doing? And what is it you're trying to accomplish? But really, as we put together our whole marketing plan, it comes down to the consumer. Why should they care? So this goes back to one of the mistakes that I see a lot is either the business owner or the company not seeing beyond themselves. So a classic example would be in your marketing materials, you don't want to lead with something talking about, well, we won this award 5 times and we're amazing. Fantastic, that's great. Maybe that's a bullet point you want to put towards the bottom as people start reading through the details. But what we want to talk about is how you're going to benefit the consumer. So that might be something like, we'll save you 10% on your energy bill throughout the year. Cool, that's a tangible thing. It's for the consumer. That's why they should care. The awards and accolades can come later on, either on your website or further on the brochure or whatever. So why should the consumer care? That needs to be one of the focal points of your messaging. And again, it goes back to how are you helping them? What is it you're really doing for them? What are their needs? And one of the things that you can also do is as you have your umbrella, and I like to look at it as an umbrella of your brand. So your brand kind of represents everything about you. But then underneath that, you have the levels of your different messages that support the brand. So it all ties in together. And so one of the things that is important to keep in mind is while your brand, for the most part, is relatively constant and consistent, your messaging can be tweaked. So when you talk about messaging, you want to be able to tailor that to your different audiences. So an example there might be if you're a driving school. I'm currently, signing up one of my kids into driving school. And the way they would tailor their messaging is they really have 2 targets. They have the targets of the parents who essentially are going to be funding the driving school and students, because they want to attract the students to tell the parents, hey, I want to go to this school, or I want to do that, or whatever. So when they talk to the parents, more than likely, they're going to hit on things like safety, reliability, insurance discounts, those types of things that parents are more concerned about. Whereas to students, the concerns maybe, or the bullet points may be more around learning in a fun environment, in a comfortable environment, having fun in a safe place and feeling secure and all those kinds of things. So it's a little bit different messaging, but the 2 commonalities between the 2 would probably be something like safety. We have a question about the difference between marketing and selling. Selling really is the transaction, and the marketing component of it is more of the education part. So a lot of times, they're very, very interrelated. Sales and marketing are like siblings. They need each other. Marketing generally puts together the materials, taking into consideration, what the consumer needs are, what their concerns might be, pre-answering any of those kinds of things, and putting together in a package that's going to resonate with the consumer. Sales then does the actual transaction and does the interfacing with the client and the consumer. So I hope that helps. To me, marketing is more of the analytics and putting together the messaging and the educational component of it, and then the strategy as far as getting the message out there, whereas sales is the transactional component of it. Okay, so let's move on. So that's our core message right there, and that's what we really talk about, having your message solidified, but then just having variations to address your individual targets when you've identified who they are. Okay, so if we move on, we'll go back to our marketing guidelines. So let's talk about this section down here: clear, concise, and consistent. So these are 3 words that you want to keep in mind as you're putting together pretty much all elements of your marketing plan. And why is that? Well, you want to be clear on who you are, being what your brand is. You want to be clear in what your message is, and you want to be very clear on who your targets are. Again, this is one of those situations where unless you have an unlimited budget, you don't have unlimited targets. So you have to keep that in mind. Where are your dollars going to be best spent, and how can you make that happen? And how can you reach these people in the most efficient way possible? Being concise. This is a big one. We're going to talk about goals in a little bit, but you want to have the clarity and being very concise on goals. One of the things that most businesses say when I ask them, why do you want to do marketing? Like 9 times out of 10, they'll say, well, I want to increase revenue. Fantastic. That's the reason why pretty much everybody's in business, is to increase revenue. But what does that look like for you? So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that particular box. Be concise in how you're targeting your targets. There are different tactics that are going to work for different audiences. If you're trying to hit a micro group of people that have a specific niche interest, putting a billboard on the freeway probably isn't going to do it for you, because that's more of a mass situation where you really want to just focus down and target and laser in on where those people are going to be found. Another biggie here is making sure that your message is easily understood. I always ask folks to try to apply the billboard test to things. So imagine you're driving down the highway and you see billboards, as we all pretty much do whenever we travel around. Which are the ones that you notice? The ones that tend to have either a very impactful image and fewer words are the ones that we notice. And the reason why that is your attention is fractional at that point, because you're watching the road, you're watching this, who knows what else you have going on in the car. You have just mere seconds to look at that. Think about how people browse the internet or social media. They're flying through that as well. So if your message can't be understood in a couple of seconds, then you probably need to work on it. So when I talk about the billboard test, can you get your message across in 6 words or less? And can you put it in a format that's going to be easily understood, that if somebody glances at it, they're going to have at least a semblance of what you're trying to say, or at least enough to pique their interest to go in deeper. Consistency. Consistency is huge. So again, when we talked about that, business owner that got tired of seeing his message or his branding stuff, well, that's him. He's seeing it all the time. You need to make sure that you maintain that brand image so you start to build impact in the market. These types of things build momentum. And the more you switch them out, the more you're going to have to start all over again. So that's why it's so important that when you're putting together your branding elements, that you love it at that time, that you feel like it's something that you can live with in the long term. Same thing with messaging. You want to be consistent with your messaging that supports your branding. And probably the biggest message of all is be consistent in your marketing. You don't want to stop and start. If we apply the analogy of marathons versus sprints, when you're continuously training, you're going to get to that marathon point, versus if you take a couple of weeks off here and there and you do a quick little sprint, and then you do another quick sprint next month, maybe 2 months later you do another little sprint, you're never going to get to that marathon point. You're just doing quick sprints and probably wasting your efforts and your resources. So let's talk about the plan. Why do you need a plan? Why does a plan matter? Multitudes of reasons. But if we look at it statistically, marketing people that have an actual written out marketing strategy were 2 times as likely to say that their marketing was effective versus those that had no written out strategy. So ask yourself, if you do something, don't you want it to be effective? Yeah, I would think so. So you want to take the time to just figure out what it is you want to do. Keeping in mind, it's flexible. What you write now, what you develop now, you can always change it. You're not going to be bound to, in 6 months if conditions change. So keep in mind, it doesn't have to be a perfect draft when you do it. The other thing to keep in mind is, of the bottom tier of marketing people, defined by how they have rated their own efficacy with their marketing plan, only 5% of these people had a strategy. So if you put these two together, if you write out your marketing plan and strategy, you have a very high potential for having a plan that's going to be beneficial for you. All right, so let's go back to our little plan here. I told you you're going to see this one a lot. So let's start at the beginning. We've talked about branding and messaging. We've talked about some of these elements here that you need to maintain through your entire process. Let's look at goals. When you do your goals, you want to make sure that you're doing SMART goals. And I'm sure you probably have heard that, initialism at this point. You want specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound. So keep that in mind when you put together your goals. And when I mentioned earlier, most businesses will say, yeah, absolutely, I want to increase revenue. Okay, that might be your goal, but it's not necessarily always your goal. You might simply have a goal of increasing your social exposure or getting more followers or doing something of that nature. But you also want to think about, okay, what's the ROI on this? And that's usually why they're tied to revenue. But let's talk about a revenue goal that you might want to make that would make more sense. So rather than just saying, I want to increase revenue, okay, that's one thing. I wouldn't say it qualifies for a SMART goal. But if we modify that goal, we could say, okay, I want to increase revenue by 10% year over year within 6 months of where I'm at now. So if we look at that, okay, that meets pretty much all of the check boxes here, being specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. But let's take it even further. Where is that revenue going to come from? Are you going to focus your marketing efforts on bringing in new customers? Are you going to focus your efforts on retaining current customers? Or what about upgrading the customers you have to either a higher package of service or to purchase more products on an average basis? Are you going to increase the average, sales transaction? Where is that revenue going to come from? So that's where I would say that's where you really want to focus on being specific and how that will support your marketing efforts, because that then gives you the area that you want to focus on. Now, if you've been in business for a while, fantastic, awesome. One of the huge benefits that you have is that you can use historical data as you have it available to help establish what your marketing goals are going to be. So even if you haven't been doing any of this stuff, you probably can go back and look at, how many sales per month were you getting, in the past year, or what was the average revenue for each month in the past year. And this will really help you look at, what are the seasonal, trends in your industry, in your business. Where can you maximize some areas? Let's say you were a seasonal company that did air conditioner switchovers. You know what your busy months are, but if you set your goals of, okay, well, I want to do 10% more revenue by getting new customers during my summer months, during the summer switchover, then you know exactly where to put your money and how to establish that goal. So maybe your goal goes from $10,000 a month to $11,000 a month. So that's why that data is your friend. So the more you have, use that to your benefit to help you get to where you want to go. Right. So how do you measure those goals? That's essentially your KPI. And that's just a lovely way of saying measure what matters. So your key performance indicators are going to be dependent on the goals you establish. So just like we talked about, we're going to look at, average revenue by month, and it's going to be during that particular time period. Decide what it is that you're going to be measuring and make sure you have a way to measure them. If you don't have that data now, then okay, then let's work to establish a baseline of what you want to do and set arbitrary goals based off of what you think might work. Because if you don't have that information, you can't track that exact number. So just make sure that as you establish your goals, you actually do have a way to track and measure them and make sure that you can identify those reporting mechanisms. So now that you have those in place, you can't just set it and forget it. You want to make sure that you're monitoring that progress and how it's moving, and share that information with whatever key stakeholders that you have, whether it's, the person in charge of customer service or tech or, inventory, whatever it may be. Just make sure you keep this information in front of the people that can impact how some of this will work for you. So measuring and data and all that stuff will do wonders for you. So try to incorporate that as much as possible. Okay, so we have our goal. So just like we had our goal of hitting a marathon, we have to find the right fuel. Because if you're training for a marathon, I'm guessing you would probably assume that eating a bunch of Twinkies for breakfast is not going to do you any favors, and that you may want to focus on stuff that's more healthy and good for you, right? Same thing with your marketing plan. You want to find, the tactics that are going to work for you, and the way you do that is through your targets and then figuring out what your timing is going to be. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here we are to our plan again. My goal is to have this embedded in your brain by the end of this presentation. So let's look at our tactics first. I'm sorry, our targets, excuse me. Let's get our targets. So going back to the notion that not everyone is your prospect, and that's perfectly fine. You want to be able to focus your time and energies on the people that actually do have potential. So going back to the question of what are you selling? What is it you're really selling and who can benefit the most? That's probably where you want to first start off when it comes to your target. Then you want to start looking at your core demographics. Now, again, if you've already been in business for a while, you have a little bit of an advantage here, and that you can look at your current customer database and find what commonalities are. Is there a certain age range that tend to typically purchase your product or service? What are their other interests? Are there certain locations that tend to buy from you more? If you're a neighborhood pizza restaurant, you probably target the neighborhood around you versus a chain restaurant that may actually target more of a metro area. So one of the things that I would say about this is, definitely do your research. There's an example I'm going to share that the large company, a mistake that they made, and it cost them a lot of money and some brand image issues maybe. So a company that I worked with years ago, they were from out of state and they were targeting the New Mexico market. And they wanted to sell a Spanish language product here in New Mexico. Now, if you're from New Mexico, you may already know where this is going. They made the assumption that, well, in New Mexico, it's a minority majority state. You have a lot of, people with Spanish heritage to some degree of different locations. So they made the assumption that, well, because over 50% of people there have a Spanish last name or have some sort of Spanish heritage, they must also speak Spanish. So what they did is they targeted everybody that had a Spanish last name and sent them marketing materials in Spanish, right? So if you're from here, you probably see how really, really wrong that was. Had they done their research, they would have known that of the 52% of people in New Mexico that have some sort of Spanish heritage, only 8% of those actually speak Spanish on a regular basis in home. So not only did they waste a ton of money, they also upset several customers and actually lost some sales from that marketing campaign. So big companies make these mistakes too. The point being is do your research. Don't make assumptions that they can waste your time and your money. And again, you might even have some branding issues at that point if you do that as well. A good idea to do here is figure out, what is this person like? If you were to put together your ideal customer or your most prospective customer, create a persona for them. What age is this person? What gender? Where do they live? What type of hobbies do they typically have? Even give them a name. That way, okay, well, especially if you have two different targets, let's say you're hitting, a woman in her 40s, maybe you name her Trish, and Trish likes to do yoga, and her income is, her household income is about 150,000. She drives this kind of car, blah, blah, blah. She hangs out at these places. Then how to target her and what her mindset is compared to a different target that you might have that might be, somebody that's, 18 to 22 that has a very different lifestyle, and you're going to want to talk to that person differently, and you want to give that person a different persona. That way it's a little bit clearer in your head that who you're talking to and how you need to adjust that messaging. Recommendations on how to do marketing plans and I'm reading the question, and a template for cheap or free micro businesses. I will show you one at the end. So all of these things we'll walk through and do an actual practical application to it so you can see how you put all these elements together. All right, so let's move on to tactics. So let's talk about tactics for a second. The tactics are the how, okay? So a lot of times when people think I need to put together a marketing plan, this is the part they think about. I need to do radio, billboard, digital, social, all that. As you can see, this is further into the process. This is about midway through the process that we're talking about tactics. You have to do all the pre-work before you even get to this point. So how do you put together a marketing plan and how do you reach your people? First thing I want to say is, regardless of what your budget is, you can do marketing. A lot of people tend to think, well, I can't afford it. I can't do this or whatever. No, you can. You just got to be a little more creative on what you do and how you do it. A lot of times when I work with new businesses that are just starting out, I advise them to start with the free to cheap stuff first, because a lot of times they don't have the marketing resources or capital to do something bigger, and that's fine. That's totally fine. Well, before we get into that, let's talk about some of the tactics that are out there. We have the traditional ones, or what are considered traditional tactics. Things like billboard, radio, TV, direct mail, those types of things. this can be a fantastic tactic to use depending on who your target is. You can have some segmentation. For example, if you're focusing on a certain neighborhood in Albuquerque, yeah, you can absolutely do that. You can buy direct mail list, or you can just focus on that one area. If you're doing TV for the entire state, absolutely, that makes sense. You could even buy into a little bit of Colorado. That would make sense depending on who you are. But if you're focusing on your neighborhood pizza chain, you're not going to want to do a TV buy that's going to be seen by everybody in New Mexico because of how the direct or the way the marketing systems are set up. TV bleeds pretty much all through New Mexico. You're going to be wasting a lot of money there, having people see your message that can access your product. So that's where you really want to think through some of the traditional tactics. The thing about that is they can be more expensive. TV is definitely more expensive than social media buys, but you do have that broader reach. So if you are wanting to hit the entire state, fantastic, go for it. Even if it's just the metro area, it could be a really good resource for you. Digital. So digital comes in multiple forms. The cheapest, easiest one is email campaigns. You can put these together for very, very little cost, even if you do it yourself. Now, there can be a whole different seminar on how to put together effective email campaigns. Quite frankly, going back to the little tenets we talked about earlier, you want to keep it concise, and you want to keep it simple and get your message across in and out. But really, when you're looking at email campaigns, this can cost you, there's an annual fee for maybe $100 through one of these different email messaging programs like Constant Contact or MailChimp or some of those like that. Next, you have your search engine optimization, which technically is free, and it's all around your website and the keywords you use, the blogs and the backlinks and the speed, all these factors go into it. And so if you're working with a web person, you definitely want to talk about this. But the same token, it does take time for these elements to manifest and get you the higher rankings when people do the search for you. So again, keep that marathon mentality, especially when working with some of these digital components. And there's also search engine marketing. The difference between SEO and SEM is that the search engine marketing is actually paid. So this would be things like your Google ads and display ads and those types of things. So again, you want to think long-term strategy, but the benefit of these is that you really can micro-target. You can seriously do some really amazing micro-targeting here and find like information about people that viewed your ad or those types of things. You can do you can have your ad set and say, this is my customer. I want people like my customer to also see this. So there's some really cool options that you can do there. But at the same time, though, again, it's a long-term situation. Another benefit of digital is you can switch out your messaging super fast and easy and do it during specific times of the day or night. And there's a lot more control around what you can do. So when you look at both traditional and digital, there's pros and cons to both. And if you can do it with your budget, absolutely have a mixture of the two in there. So those are our tactics. And again, you can accommodate your tactics to whatever budget level you have. I mentioned email for companies that are just starting out and don't really have a budget. The way I would rank them is I would say start with email for sure and social. Those are probably the two biggest things. And of course, make sure you have your website up and going. But as far as when you start doing paid stuff, that's probably where I would focus on. And then also look at your SEM. But again, it's all going to flow in with your budget and what industry you're in and those types of things. All right, so let's spend a little minute talking about social. Social it's another one of those topics that you could probably spend a good week talking about. The thing about social is it's very low cost, which makes it so attractive, and it's also highly used. It's very targeted, and it can be very, very flexible. The big key here is there's a much higher need for consistency. Social media is consumed so quickly and so often, and there's so much content out there that you need to be out there on a very consistent and constant basis. The other thing that you want to keep in mind is it's social media. So you want to keep it social. You don't want to spend your entire time selling your product. Years ago, I heard, I can't remember from one of my instructors about, look at the rule of thirds. Have a third of it be purely social and fun stuff, a third of it be educational, and then a third of it be sales oriented. Those types of things. So you might want to just keep that little thing in mind to make sure that you have a nice, robust, realm of content that you're sharing. And really, you want to think of it as developing a community around your pages and your channels and having people come to you for advice and establishing yourself as, either somebody fun to to watch and follow, or somebody that could be an educational resource on the area of industry that you cover. So if you're new to social media, which from a business perspective, some people may be, you really have to think about what platform is going to make the most sense for you. So there's, of course, Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn, a bunch of other ones. And what you really just want to look at is what are the demographics for each of these different platforms, and do they match up with who you are trying to target? So often I see, I mentioned social media to business owners, they get that feeling of, oh my gosh, that's so much I have to do, and it's so overwhelming. My recommendation on that is pick the one that you feel like makes the most sense for your consumers to start with. Get that one down, get it mastered, and then bring on another one. And then if you want to bring on another one, do that, but do them one at a time so it doesn't feel like it's so much. And a lot of times you can just repurpose the content, or you can use a social media aggregator like Hootsuite or Sprout Social, or those types of things where you can actually post content on multiple channels at the same time and schedule those things out. That's actually a huge time saver too. Let's think about which one would make the most sense for you. And one of the huge benefits of social media is that you get to hear in real time what your consumers are saying about you. And this practice is called social listening. And this is a fantastic way to get, feedback on, how your business is performing. What do they think about your products and services? So something that I would definitely recommend for all businesses, but definitely something for new businesses as well. It's a question from Julie. Based on my research, it seems that groups would be a good place to be social. Absolutely. And comments on Facebook groups. Thank you so much for bringing this up, Julie. So pretty much in Facebook and LinkedIn and some other platforms, there's groups that exist. And I'll just give you a quick Facebook example. I'm part of the film community also. So there's tons of Facebook film groups. And that's a great place to get to know people in that industry or to share information about what you're doing. So for example, let's just say you were an artist. I'm almost certain wherever you live, there are artist communities on Facebook and groups. And the way you find those is you just go into the search engine, or the search tab on top of the social platform, whichever one you're on. And let's just say you want to put New Mexico artists. So you put that in there, you get a bunch of different groups that, are potential matches. You pick which ones make the most for you. Sometimes they make you join and answer some questions, which is a good thing because, they don't want, anybody there. But now you're within that group and you can post things directly in that group. Again, keep in mind, it's social. So you don't always want to be promoting stuff about yourself on there, but it's a great place to learn from each other, share information, and also sometimes promote yourself. So thank you for bringing that up. Same thing exists on LinkedIn. So definitely explore those things, see what's going on in your industry, in your particular city, whatever it may be. But those are great places to get some exposure to people that may actually have a need for your services. All right, so let's move on to timing. All right, when it comes to timing, you definitely want to leverage what's going to work for you and look at the times that make the most sense. So we talked a little bit earlier about the air conditioning company. They definitely have seasonal time periods, in the spring when it's starting to get hot and when it's starting to get cold and people need to have their heaters turned on. So if they were to put together their marketing plan, they would want to get ahead of those seasons and really get their name out in the market a month or so before peak season, just so they're top of mind when people decide they need those services. So that's one example of how seasonal timing might factor into what you do. But are there other things such as, are you reopening? Are you launching a product? What's going on within your company that might need more marketing support during certain times of the year than others? Look at the resources that you have. Again, if you're doing a product launch, you might want to start doing teaser marketing or build up and those types of things, pre-orders, all that good stuff, and timing that with your marketing plan. You also want to look at community partnerships. If you're let's say you're a cancer organization, there's certain months that are breast cancer awareness versus brain cancer awareness versus different types of cancers. Does it make sense to partner with them if you're providing cancer services to be able to work with them to help them reach that population? So that's a classic example of how you can partner with another company and leverage both of your resources to mutual benefit. So why not, right? The other thing you want to look at is their community education opportunities. So in that particular scenario, can you put together an event with this partner company that could bring people in and offer free services to people that might need it while you also promote your company as supporting this effort? When you do something like that, you may also have local press opportunities. You definitely want to get the word out that you're going to be offering this community service and share that with the media. Public relations is a whole other situation, but you definitely want to make sure if you're doing something that's worthy of community knowledge, look at considering, press releases and working with the PR person or working with the media people to get more information about that out to the community. And then of course, there's the business outreach. This might be more of a B2B play, but are there trade events that you need to be at? Can you present seminars at these events? Or are there speaking opportunities or opportunities to be on advisory panels or do research? There's lots of things on here that may have some timing factors that you would want to build into your plan to make sure that you're leveraging your dollars appropriately. So there's a couple of areas that tend to get neglected. And let's talk about those because there's a lot of potential there. These two right here, internal marketing and retention. So let's talk about internal marketing first. The last thing you want is to put together a beautiful marketing plan and have great campaign materials, great messaging, and then you don't tell your internal team about it. And when somebody comes and approaches a sales team about this great offer that you put out there, they don't know what's going on. And I've seen this happen at large companies. Make sure that everybody in your group knows exactly what's going on, especially your sales team. Your sales team, like I said, they're sibling organizations or sibling departments, and you want to make sure that you're working together. Work with them because they hear directly a lot of times, from the consumer. What are the relevant hot points? What would be impactful? Those types of things. So include everybody on your team. The other thing that you can do that a lot of people don't really think about is how can you incentivize your other internal departments? If you have a team that's dedicated to customer service, how can you incentivize them to help promote the particular campaign that you're working on or your marketing initiatives? Can you do internal contests on customer service metrics? Same thing with your finance team. If people are having problems with their billing, they may not be as likely to recommend you to other companies. So can you do things on the accounting and billing side and incentivize that team to improve better, to increase customer retention and customer loyalty? So there's things that all internal departments can do that can help your overall organization. But at a bare minimum, make sure you keep them all informed of what you're doing. That way they can also serve as brand ambassadors and promotional experts when they're out on the streets or talking to other folks as well. And if you can get them to share content on social, there's lots of little things you can do, but make sure you include your entire organization in your marketing plan and keep them posted on what's coming up. Retention. This is quite frankly the biggest heartbreak of marketing to me, and that there's not as much attention spent on this area that I feel needs to be. Acquiring a new customer can be exponentially more expensive than just keeping a current customer happy. And if you can increase your retention, according to the statistic, by 5%, you have huge potential gains on your profit side. So what do you do for retention? How do you make that work? Well, it's as simple as using a free email service or some of the free efforts that we have here, checking in with them. How are you doing? You want to do a quick survey, let us know how you're doing, and we'll give you a $5 discount on your next purchase, or just happy anniversary. You've been with us for a year. We're happy to have you with us, blah, blah, blah. Little simple things. Or if you are launching a new product, thank you for being a loyal customer. We want to give you the first sneak peek at our new product that's coming up. Little things like that, just keeping them feeling loved in your realm of company, then yeah, little things like that can really go a long way. And if you do research on retention for employees and customers, it's amazing how just a simple thank you carries a lot of weight. So again, it doesn't have to be anything expensive. Something as simple as a thank you email or a thank you card or whatever it is, depending on whatever your business may be. So keep those in mind. Okay, so putting it all together. You're going to be shocked at how simple this actually is. At least I think you will be. So we talked about all these different components. So what does this look like, right? So here are our grids, right? Our brand, and this is just a fictitious company that I made up. It's a camera company. So the brand that they're building for themselves is they have this high-end camera. It's an intuitive camera for innovative photographers. So that's their brand. That's how they see themselves. That's how they want to be seen. The key messages that they tend to focus on is creatively capturing moments that last a lifetime, right? Photographs do that, but that's just how they're positioning that. So let's go block by block to see how they apply what we talked about in the scenario. So their goal is going to be to increase revenue by 7% year over year. Cool, we got that. The way they're going to do that is they're going to increase year over year new customers by 20%. And they're also going to increase camera sales by 10% because they have a launch coming up later in the year. Cool. So now we know what the goal is and how it's going to be measured and how they're going to get there. Their target, based off of the current client base, is they're going to focus on women in New Mexico because that tends to be the bulk of who their current base is right now. Of that, 65% of them are professionals. So that's probably going to be their target one, primary target. 82% are between the ages of 35 and 55. All right, cool. It's good to know because factoring, how we talk to these folks, they tend to be a little bit more on the mature side. Right on. Tactics that we're going to use. We're going to use social media. We're going to use email and print. So already we have a fairly nominal budget here, as you can tell by the tactics that we're focusing on. Timing. We'll get to that in just a little bit. And the internal marketing. We're going to do some social incentives to our employees. And we're also going to do a sales incentive because we're launching this new product. We want to get everybody on the team excited about potentially selling this. So we'll give them a percentage of each camera sold. On the retention side, we're going to offer our loyal customers discounts on this new product. We're going to allow them special hours to do pre-purchases. And we're also going to do a social incentive. Given that this is a camera company, visuals and photographs are at the center of what they do. So that's something that they can really push on like Instagram and Facebook and stuff like that. So this is how the grids or the boxes come into play. This is what it looks like. A simple marketing plan built in Excel. So as long as you have a spreadsheet program of some sort, you can build your own marketing plan. And really, this is as simple as it is. What we have here is we just have the months of the year taking us through the end of the year. And I do recommend that when you put together your marketing plan, that you want to build it for at least 6 to 12 months. Again, it's a framework. It's a guideline. You can always move things around if you need to. But let's look at what we have here. What are the seasonal themes that are going to be going on during this time period? Well, Mother's Day, Father's Day, 4th of July, summer stuff, back to school. All of these present opportunities to thematically promote photographs and cameras. Do we have any company stuff going on? Yeah, we have a reopening here. This is where we're going to be doing our camera launch. So this is going to be big to us. Our target here, we talked about our target on the previous one. Key messages, we talked a little bit about that too, but we're also going to talk about safety and new hours and those types of things here. So when we look at the tactics, again, we're starting with some of the cheaper ones that we have here, social media. So this is a very high level plan. You could go deeper and deeper and deeper as much as you want to, but just to get started, you could do something as simple as this. So this tells me I'm going to be focusing on Instagram and Facebook pretty much for the entire year. If I wanted to, I could add another line down here and actually put dollar amounts of how much I'm going to be spending every month so I can track that and know exactly what I'm going to be doing. My second tactic is going to be email. So once a month, I'm going to be sending out a constant contact email to my, loyal customers. Maybe I send out one slightly different message to my prospects. Maybe I have my lists segmented there. And so I adjust my messaging to hit each of those targets appropriately. And then tactic number 3, this is pure for planning purposes, is I need to know, okay, if I have this great reopening happening in June, I need to make sure I have money allocated and time allocated to create and order new now open signs. I'm going to want to go ahead and promote my opening in the newspaper because it's a smaller community that I'm going to be focusing on, and they do get readership in that particular community. And so I want to focus that around there. I've also built in some newspaper around the holidays. Okay, so now I know I'm going to do that. So I feel secure in that realm. Now, again, this is flexible. If I do the 2 months in June and July and I realize, okay, that really wasn't the best bang for my buck, this can get canceled or completely changed. If I find out this was amazing for me, I may want to go ahead and add another month here. So again, it's flexible depending on how your progress is going. Internal marketing, I have my social incentives laid out when I'm going to be doing them. And on the retention side, I know what I want to have here during each of the months that I want to do that. So fairly simple. It's just a matter of taking the time to put it into an actual format that works best for you. And like I mentioned, this can be adjusted up and down a million different ways. So fine-tuning your progress. Once you have your plan in place, you want to make sure you get the best results possible. So that just means, work your plan, review your results, your goals, your tactics, all of that stuff. Always review that. And if you need to, refine it. Again, it's not set in stone. So if you need to switch out your messaging or some tactical elements or adjust your budgets, absolutely do so. But the one thing is, just don't stop. Don't stop. Keep going. Things are going to happen, like we all experienced a few years ago. You want to pause, You want to pivot and go a different direction, but you want to persevere and keep going. And it can be anything from operational changes, budgetary adjustments, or huge environmental shifts that we all recently experienced. But the key to this is make sure that you understand the needs of your target. What is it they really need and how can you be the solution? Connect with them where they are. And that comes down to using your tactics appropriately and finding out where these people are going to be and where they're going to see your messaging. And then be authentic in how you communicate with them. You just want to make sure that they understand who you are and what you're trying to do for them. An example was how Black Friday switched. In 2019, people were upset about, people even working on Thanksgiving Day, and it was, in-store specials, blah, blah, blah. In 2020, we all experienced shutdowns. So it went to, they don't even want you in the stores anymore. It's curbside delivery and things are getting done online and multiple rounds. Go to 2021, now we're dealing with supplier issues. So now they're pushing everybody to shop early and doing online and in person. So quick example of how things can quickly change, but you just need to roll with it based off of what's going on in the environment and what's going to make your consumer feel safe and comfortable. So for final recommendations, create and follow your plan. That's really what it comes down to. Just take the time to do that. Be prepared to be flexible, knowing that things are going to change, and review your progress regularly and see where you do want to change and fine tune that messaging and just keep that progress going. The bottom line is continue moving forward. If you need more resources, you can always go to the SBDC site. They have tons of training opportunities and counseling and all kinds of great stuff to support your business. And that is essentially it. We have a few minutes. I know I rushed that last little bit, but I want to make sure y'all have time for any questions that you may have had. So I will stop there. So if you have any questions, just feel free to pop them into the question box.
Thank you, Julie, thank you, Diane. It's been a day. While we're waiting for some questions, I just wanted to go ahead and thank you for your presentation and all the valuable information that you've given us today. And I want to encourage our participants to visit the nmsbdc.org website. There you can find upcoming no-cost webinars, and you can also sign up for no-cost counseling services. And remember, we're always here to help, so please don't hesitate to reach out to us anytime. But let's see if anyone has any other questions.
Doesn't look like it, but as was mentioned earlier, I believe you all will be getting a copy of the presentation. That's correct, right?
Yes, that is correct. All of you will receive a copy of the presentation as well as links to the on-demand recording of this webinar, as well as some of our YouTube links as well for previous webinars. All right, well, then I guess I'll go ahead and end it. Diane, thank you so much, and I wish you all a great day.
Thank you all for being here.